The year is 1862. A Union Army surgeon is standing over a wounded soldier in a field hospital near Richmond. The soldier has already lost enormous amounts of blood, so much that his skin is pale, his breathing shallow, his pulse barely detectable. By any measure, this man is dying from blood loss. The surgeon makes a decision. He picks up a lancet and opens a vein in the soldier's arm, and he bleeds him. Not a small amount, not as a last resort, but as a deliberate part of the treatment, removing what little strength the man has left. And the strangest part, the surgeon genuinely believed he was helping. This is not a scene from a horror film. This is documented medical practice in the American Civil War. And this was not unusual. It was a standard practice. For more than 2,000 years, physicians across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East practiced bloodletting, the deliberate removal of blood from the human body. They did it for fevers, for infections, for mental illness, for pneumonia, for almost every ailment imaginable, including the very condition causing the bleeding in the first place. And here is the question that will follow us through this story. Why? Why would intelligent, trained physicians continue a treatment that so obviously made their patients worse? Why did it take 2,000 years to stop? And what does this tell us about medical practice today, and the mistakes we might be making right now? This is the story of bloodletting, and it is the story of how even the most intelligent people can be trapped by the authority of the past. Consider the death of George Washington in 1799. It began with a minor respiratory infection, likely what we would now recognize as acute epiglottitis, or strep throat. By modern standards, it was manageable, but his physicians, operating within the certainty of the medical system of their time, prescribed what they believed was the correct treatment. They opened his veins not once, but repeatedly. Over the course of a single day, they removed an extraordinary amount of blood from a body already struggling against inflammation and fever. As the hours passed, Washington grew weaker, pale, clammy. His pulse became faint, his breathing more labored. By nightfall, the first president of the United States was dead. Not because the disease was untreatable, but because the treatment itself had pushed him past the point of recovery. He died under the care of the very men sworn to save him. And yet, in the aftermath, his physicians did not question what they had done. They did not abandon the practice. Instead, they reached for explanations that preserved it. The illness had been too aggressive, the intervention too late, the bleeding perhaps not sufficient. Mozart met a similar end at just 35. He died in December 1791. While the specific nature of his final illness remains a subject of debate, the historical consensus suggests he, too, was subjected to the lancet. Whether bloodletting was the primary cause of death or merely the final blow to a weakened system, the fact remains. No physician of the era would have hesitated. To bleed the patient was the standard of care. Not doing it would have been seen as negligence. Washington and Mozart weren't exceptions. They were high-profile examples of something that was happening everywhere. Patients with minor illnesses were weakened into collapse. Others, already critically ill, were stripped of the very resources their bodies needed to survive. Some might have recovered with nothing more than rest and time. Instead, they were treated, and that treatment made them worse. Not because physicians were careless, but because they were certain. These were the most trained, most respected minds of their time. They weren't guessing. They were following a system that, to them, made complete sense. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because when a system feels complete, it stops being questioned. Even when outcomes don't match expectations, even when patients die, the conclusion doesn't change. The system is protected, and once a system reaches that point, it doesn't correct itself. It sustains itself. Which raises the real question: how does something like this begin? And more importantly, how does it last for 2,000 years? The history of bloodletting begins not with physicians but with philosophers, and with a very simple observation: bleed someone and you see blood. Cut open an animal and you see blood. It is everywhere. So ancient thinkers, especially the Greeks, asked a logical question. What if disease is caused by an excess of something in the blood? Around 400 BC, a Greek physician named Hippocrates developed a theory of 4 bodily humors. These were 4 essential fluids, he believed, that kept the body in balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humors were in proper proportion, you were healthy. When they fell out of balance, you became sick. And in this framework, the logic seemed to work. A fever makes the body hot. The skin turns red. Blood vessels swell. It appeared as if there was too much blood driving the illness, so the solution felt obvious. Remove the excess, restore balance, and the body would recover. That idea didn't stay theoretical, it spread. It was taught, repeated, refined, and over time, it stopped being questioned. For the next 2,000 years, practically every physician in the world accepted it as medical fact. Galen, who dominated medicine in the Roman world, reinforced it further. He argued that the body continuously produced blood, and if it was constantly being created, it must also accumulate like water filling a container. And if it accumulated, it had to be drained. By the medieval period, bloodletting had become standardized. Physicians followed detailed charts dictating which veins to open, how much blood to remove, and even when, depending on the season. It looked precise. It looked structured. It looked like science. And it was taken very seriously. In 1163, the Council of Tours forbade priests from practicing bloodletting, not because it didn't work, but because direct contact with blood was considered beneath the clergy. The practice didn't disappear. It shifted to barber surgeons, men trained in technique, not theory. And that distinction mattered because the procedure continued, even as understanding did not. By the 1500s, bloodletting wasn't just common, it was expected. When you were sick, you went to a physician, and very often the prescription was the same: bleed. Which brings us to the more difficult question. How does an entire profession, people who had dedicated their lives to healing, continue a treatment that so often made their patients worse? Part of the answer lies in what we now call confirmation bias. When a patient was bled and improved, the physician attributed the recovery to the treatment. The theory was confirmed. When a patient was bled and died, the conclusion didn't change. The treatment had not been applied correctly, not early enough, not aggressively enough, or the disease had simply progressed too far. Failure didn't challenge the system, it reinforced it. There was no possible outcome that could prove the treatment wrong. Every result fits the theory. And there was another layer. Bloodletting was expensive. In the 1600s, a physician's visit could cost as much as a craftsman earned in a week. If you were wealthy enough to afford treatment, you received it. If you recovered, the physician's reputation grew. If you died, you were already ill. Very few people questioned what they had paid for. There was little incentive to challenge the system. And without pressure from within or from outside, it continued for centuries. But the real problem wasn't that the theory sounded convincing. It was what happened when it was applied. Because when you step away from the explanations and look at the outcomes, a very different picture emerges. In 1821, a 15-year-old girl named Harriet Martineau came down with a fever. Her family called a physician. He examined her and diagnosed what he believed was a serious imbalance and prescribed what was considered the correct treatment: aggressive bloodletting. At first, it would have looked like treatment, a controlled procedure that followed the logic of the system. Blood drawn, the body expected to rebalance, but the fever did not break. So he bled her again and again. Over the following weeks, more blood was removed from a body that was already weakening. And with each treatment, her condition did not improve, it deteriorated. She became weaker, paler, increasingly delirious. And each time her condition worsened, the physician reached the same conclusion. The disease required more aggressive treatment. More blood needed to be removed. Harriet Martineau survived, but her health never fully recovered. She went on to become a pioneering 19th century British author, journalist, and social theorist, often called the mother of sociology. But she spent decades believing she was on the edge of death, living with the lasting consequences of a treatment that had nearly killed her. She documented her experience as an invalid in her 1844 book, Life in the Sick Room. And her case was not unusual. What happened to her was happening everywhere. Across the 1800s, physicians were bleeding patients with pneumonia, with tuberculosis, with sepsis, conditions where the body was already under extreme strain, and the pattern was consistent. Patients failed to recover reliably, often grew weaker over time, and in many cases did not survive. But the conclusion didn't change. If a patient worsened, it wasn't taken as evidence that the treatment was harmful. It was taken as evidence that it hadn't been applied aggressively enough. So they were bled again. And when that didn't work, they were bled again. This is the point where the story stops being surprising and becomes difficult to accept. Because medicine at the time wasn't built to detect failure, it was built to explain it. And it wasn't unified, it was divided, competing schools of thought, each certain it was right. On one side were the followers of a Scottish physician named John Brown. They believed illness came from weakness, from a lack of stimulation. The body, in their view, had become depleted, underactive, unable to sustain itself. And the solution was to push it back into motion. Alcohol, opium, stimulation. Force the body to respond. On the other side stood François Broussais. He believed the exact opposite. Disease, he argued, was not weakness, it was excess. Too much irritation, too much inflammation. And the only way to treat it was to remove it. Not cautiously, but aggressively. Broussais didn't just bleed his patients. He covered them in leeches, sometimes dozens at a time, drawing out blood in an attempt to drain the inflammation itself. And this wasn't fringe medicine, it was influential. Hospitals adopted it, students were trained in it. For a time, this was considered advanced medical practice. What followed wasn't progress, it was a battle. Two completely different theories, two completely different treatments. Each side convinced the other was dangerously wrong. But here's what matters. Despite their differences, the outcome was the same. Whether physicians tried to stimulate the body or drain it, patients failed to recover consistently, often grew weaker over time, and in many cases did not survive. And yet, that wasn't the conclusion. Physicians didn't question the system itself. They argued over which explanation to trust. And so the argument continued. Until a small number of physicians approached the problem differently. Not by proposing a new theory, but by asking a simpler question. What actually happens to patients? They stopped theorizing, and they started counting. A French physician named Pierre Charles-Alexandre Louis began tracking cases of pneumonia. He compared those who were treated with early, aggressive bloodletting to those who were not. And what he found was difficult to ignore. Patients who were heavily bled did not recover faster. In many cases, they were more likely to die. For the first time, the practice wasn't being challenged by opinion, or authority, or tradition. It was being challenged by outcomes, by numbers. And the numbers were pointing in one direction. Others began to see the same pattern. Physicians like John Hughes Bennett warned that bloodletting was not just ineffective, but dangerous. Some even ran early comparisons, showing higher survival rates in patients who were not bled at all. The evidence was there, clear, measurable, reproducible. And yet, the system didn't change. Because bloodletting wasn't just a treatment, it was the foundation, woven into the logic of how disease worked, how physicians were trained, how medicine understood the human body. And when you challenge a foundation, it doesn't fall, it resists. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because what Louis observed in hospitals, William Williams Keene saw on the battlefield. During the American Civil War, Keene worked as a surgeon treating wounded soldiers, men who had already lost blood, already on the edge of survival. He didn't rely on theory, he saw the outcomes directly, and the pattern was the same. Bloodletting did not prevent infection, it did not improve recovery, it weakened patients who were already barely surviving. Keene documented what he saw, he published his findings, he challenged the practice openly, and nothing changed. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because it didn't fit the system. Because bloodletting wasn't just a treatment, it was the framework through which medicine understood disease itself. And when a framework like that is challenged, it doesn't collapse, it holds, even when the evidence is right in front of it. So what finally ended it? The answer is not a single person or a single discovery. Bloodletting did not collapse all at once, nor was it abandoned because one physician finally won the argument. It ended because, over time, the entire logic holding it up began to break apart. The first crack came with microscopy. For the first time, physicians could actually see what blood was. A living tissue that carried oxygen and fought infection. Removing it wasn't restoring health. It was taking away something the body desperately needed. Then came germ theory. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch showed that disease was not caused by humoral imbalance, but by microorganisms. A fever was not evidence of too much blood. It was the body reacting to infection and fighting back. Transfusion made the contradiction impossible to ignore. If blood needed to be restored when lost, why had physicians spent centuries removing it? And statistics delivered the final verdict. Bled patients had worse outcomes. Non-bled patients survived at higher rates. The numbers said what tradition had resisted for centuries. By 1900, bloodletting was rapidly disappearing from mainstream medicine in Europe and North America. It persisted longer in some places, remaining in use in parts of Eastern Europe well into the 20th century. But as a serious medical doctrine, it was dying. It had taken 2,000 years. And in the end, bloodletting was not defeated by a better argument alone. It was defeated when too many different lines of evidence began pointing in the same direction, and the system could no longer explain them away. That Union surgeon in 1862 wasn't an anomaly, he was standard practice, right up until the framework beneath him collapsed. They weren't ignoring the evidence, they simply couldn't see it clearly enough to stop. Now here is what makes this relevant. The system that sustained bloodletting still exists, it just looks different. In the 20th century, antibiotics were prescribed so widely that they began to lose effectiveness. Patients improved and the treatment appeared to work. But over time, resistant bacteria emerged, creating a problem that was not immediately visible. In the 1990s, opioids were promoted as safe and non-addictive. Physicians prescribed in good faith. Patients reported relief. The system reinforced itself, until hundreds of thousands were dead. In both cases, the pattern is familiar. A treatment appears to work, authority endorses it, it becomes standard practice. The cost only becomes visible later. The difference is not that we are more intelligent today. It is that we have built better tools, controlled trials, statistical analysis, peer review, to detect when we are wrong. But those tools are only effective if they are used with discipline. Bloodletting did not persist because physicians were ignorant. It persisted because within the system they were trained in, the evidence never seemed strong enough to overturn what they already believed. And that matters. Not because we should mock the past, but because the same mechanism still exists in us. The risk is not that we repeat bloodletting. The risk is that we repeat the way it was defended.